He was never supposed to be the hero. He was the obstacle, the cliché, the crown prince of a small-town kingdom built on hairspray and fleeting high school glory. But what if the greatest trick the Duffer Brothers ever pulled wasn't a monster from another dimension, but the slow, deliberate, and heartbreaking transformation of the one character we were all meant to hate? The story of Steve Harrington isn't the story of a jock who found a heart of gold. It's the story of a boy who was stripped of his crown, his status, and everything he thought defined him, only to find his true self in the darkness that threatened to swallow his world whole. Okay, we gotta know before we start. Team Steve, Team Jonathan, or Team Eddie? Drop it below. All right, now that battle lines are drawn, let's head back to the seemingly perfect, terrifyingly fragile world of Hawkins, Indiana. In the autumn of 1983, Hawkins, Indiana, was a town ruled by simple hierarchies, and at the very top of the food chain sat Steve Harrington. He wasn't just a student at Hawkins High, he was an institution. His throne was the driver's seat of his maroon 1981 BMW 730i, a symbol of casual wealth and parental absence that granted him a level of freedom most teens could only dream of. His crown was a perfectly coiffed, gravity-defying mound of hair, a masterpiece of Farrah Fawcett spray, and meticulous morning rituals that seemed to hold its shape even against the Midwestern wind. He was King Steve, a title whispered with a mixture of aspiration and resentment in the school hallways. His court was comprised of Tommy H. and Carol, two sycophants who orbited him like moons, reflecting his own arrogance back at him and validating his every casual cruelty. They were the popular kids, the ones who decided who was in and who was out, their laughter echoing from the back of classrooms and at weekend parties held in empty houses. Steve's world was small, but he was its master. It was a world of football games under Friday night lights, of making out in cars parked by Lover's Lake, of a future that seemed pre-written and comfortably bright. He would graduate, probably slide into a job at his father's company, and marry the perfect girl. And in 1983, he thought he'd found her. Nancy Wheeler wasn't just his girlfriend. She was a validation of his status. She was smart, pretty, and from a good family, the perfect queen for King Steve. Their relationship, however, was built more on the idea of what they should be than who they actually were. It was a performance of high school romance, full of stolen moments and whispered promises that lacked any real depth. Steve's affection was genuine, but possessive. He saw her as an extension of himself, another jewel in his crown. This worldview made him blind to the complexities of others. He saw Jonathan Byers not as a lonely, artistic boy, grieving the fracture of his family, but as a freak. He was weird, quiet, and carried a camera everywhere, a silent observer on the fringes of Steve's sun-drenched kingdom. Steve's interactions with him were dismissive, laced with the casual disdain of someone who has never had to question their own place in the world. He was, in every sense of the word, a bully, but he likely wouldn't have even seen it that way. In his mind, he was just maintaining the natural order of things. His life was governed by a simple, self-serving philosophy. Look out for number one. His problems were small, contained things like acing a test he didn't study for or convincing Nancy to come over when her parents were out. The darkness that festered beneath the surface of Hawkins was completely invisible to him, a frequency he was incapable of hearing. He was concerned with the tangible, the immediate, the superficial. His greatest struggle was maintaining the perfect facade of his life, a life built on a foundation of unexamined privilege and the shallow loyalties of high school cliques. He was confident, not because he was secure, but because he had never been truly challenged. He was a king ruling over a kingdom of glass, utterly unaware of the storm gathering just beyond the horizon. The Steve Harrington of 1983 was a finished product, or so he thought. He was the end result of a comfortable upbringing, a popular social life, and a complete lack of any real adversity. Little did he know, he wasn't a finished product at all. He was just the starting material. He was the block of marble, waiting for the chisel of unimaginable terror to carve away the excess and reveal the form that was hiding within. But for now, he was just Steve Harrington, driving with his windows down, the radio blasting, completely, blissfully, and dangerously unaware that his entire world and his very identity was about to be ripped apart. The kingdom was about to fall, and the king was about to be humbled in the most brutal way imaginable. The first crack in Steve's perfectly curated world didn't appear with a monstrous roar or a flicker of lights. It began with a simple, nagging annoyance, the disappearance of Barbara Holland. For Steve, Barb was less a person and more an accessory to his girlfriend Nancy. She was the nerdy, responsible friend who was always in the way, the obstacle to be overcome for a few precious moments alone with Nancy. On that fateful night at Steve's empty house, his focus was singular and selfish. He wanted Nancy, and Barb was the price of admission. He encouraged her to shotgun a beer, a casual act of peer pressure designed to loosen her up and, more importantly, get her out of the way. When she cut her hand, his concern was fleeting, overshadowed by his own desires. He sent her outside to sit by the pool, alone, a lonely sentinel in the chilly November air, while he and Nancy disappeared upstairs. He didn't see the flicker in the water. He didn't hear the guttural shriek that was swallowed by the night. To him, Barb just left. The next day, her absence was a nuisance, a complication in his relationship with Nancy. He couldn't understand Nancy's spiraling anxiety. In his world, people didn't just vanish. They got grounded. They ran off. They showed up a day later with a story. His attempts to comfort Nancy were hollow, textbook lines from a movie about teenage romance. He told her Barb was probably fine, that her parents were just overreacting. He was trying to patch the hole in his reality, to smooth things over so life could go back to normal. But the catalyst for his change wasn't just Barb's disappearance. It was his own jealousy. He saw Nancy growing closer to Jonathan Byers, the school freak. He saw them whispering in the hallways, saw them driving off together. His mind, steeped in the simplistic logic of high school drama, jumped to the most obvious conclusion. His girlfriend was cheating on him. This was a language he understood. Betrayal, infidelity. It was a threat to his status, a direct challenge to his crown. The weirdness of Barb's disappearance was abstract, but this was concrete. This was personal. His anger festered, fueled by the snide remarks of Tommy and Carol. One night, he saw a light on in Nancy's bedroom and decided to pay her a surprise visit, a grand romantic gesture to win her back. But as he climbed up to her window, he didn't see her waiting for him. He saw her with Jonathan, in her bedroom. The image shattered him. The sight of them together, looking comfortable, looking intimate, confirmed his worst fears. It didn't matter that they were poring over photos, hunting for a monster. All Steve saw was the ultimate betrayal. The king had been usurped by the outcast. His reaction was swift and cruel. He stormed off, his hurt curdling into rage. The next day at the Hawk Theater, he unleashed that rage not on Nancy, but on the town itself. With Tommy's help, he spray-painted a message for the world to see, branding Nancy a slut in bright red paint. It was a petty, cowardly act, a public shaming designed to reclaim his power by destroying her reputation. But the act gave him no satisfaction. It was hollow, and it led to the physical manifestation of his conflict, a brutal alleyway fight with Jonathan. Jonathan, pushed to his limit by the disappearance of his brother and the town's indifference, confronted Steve, and fists flew. Steve, for perhaps the first time in his life, was met with a fury that had nothing to do with social status and everything to do with real, raw pain. The police broke it up, but not before Jonathan landed a few solid blows. Later, when Steve was cleaning up his bruised face, something shifted. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was confused. The incident forced him to confront the graffiti, to really look at what he'd done. He found himself trying to clean it, a pathetic attempt to erase his own ugliness. It was in this moment of quiet shame that the first seeds of doubt were planted. What if he was wrong? What if the story Nancy and Jonathan were telling, the crazy story about a monster, wasn't a lie to cover up an affair? The catalyst wasn't just one event, but a cascade of them. A missing girl, a perceived betrayal, a public act of cruelty, and a humbling physical confrontation. These events combined to smash the mirror in which Steve Harrington had always admired himself, forcing him to see a reflection he didn't recognize and didn't like. His kingdom was crumbling, not because of some external force, but because of his own actions. He was beginning to realize that the world was far bigger and far more terrifying than he had ever imagined, and his place in it was no longer secure. He was adrift, and for the first time, truly alone. The world Steve Harrington knew was defined by clear lines: jocks and nerds, popular and outcast, normal and weird. But as the autumn of 1983 bled into a strange and terrifying winter, those lines began to blur and then erase completely. The key figure that rose to challenge his worldview wasn't a rival for his throne or a new face at school. It was Nancy Wheeler, the very person he thought he knew best. He had always seen her as his girlfriend, a prize, the perfect complement to his own image. He never truly saw her as an individual with her own agency, her own courage, and her own darkness to confront. As she dove deeper into the mystery of Barb's disappearance, she was transforming, and in doing so, she was pulling him into a new, frightening reality against his will. His first real glimpse of this new world came through a shattered window. After his fight with Jonathan and his pathetic attempt to scrub the graffiti off the movie theater marquee, a wave of guilt, or perhaps just confusion, washed over him. He went to the buyer's house, maybe to apologize, maybe to yell some more. He probably didn't even know himself. What he found was a scene of utter chaos. He saw Nancy and Jonathan, not in a romantic embrace, but working together with a grim, desperate intensity. They were laying bear traps on the living room floor, hammering nails through a baseball bat, preparing for war. It was a sight so bizarre, so out of place in his understanding of the world, that it stopped him in his tracks. This wasn't a teenage love triangle. This was something else entirely. It was Nancy's fierce determination that truly broke through his wall of denial. He saw a fire in her eyes he'd never seen before, a resolve that had nothing to do with school dances or popular opinion. She was hunting something, and that something was hunting them. The rise of this unlikely faction, the quiet freak and the determined good girl, forced Steve to make a choice. He could retreat back into his world of comfortable ignorance, dismiss them as crazy, and drive away. Or he could cross a threshold from which there would be no return. His jealousy, the very thing that had driven his worst actions, now became a strange and twisted motivator for good. He couldn't stand the thought of leaving Nancy alone with Jonathan, especially not in a house that looked like a death trap. His possessiveness, for once, aligned with a protective instinct he didn't know he had. He climbed back through the window, not to stake a claim, but to offer help. His entrance was awkward, arrogant even. "I'm not trying to be a hero," he insisted, a line that dripped with irony. He was still King Steve, trying to assert his dominance even in a situation he couldn't possibly comprehend. But the bravado was a thin veneer over a growing sense of terror. The flickering lights, the tense silence, the sheer insanity of hammering nails into a bat, it was all real. And as the lights began to flash with frantic intensity, signaling the monster's approach, his arrogance finally dissolved into pure, unadulterated fear. This was the true rise of a new order in his life. It wasn't about him anymore. His social status, his car, his hair, none of it mattered in the face of a creature that could walk through walls. The hierarchy of Hawkins High was meaningless here. In this strange, terrifying alliance, the only thing that mattered was survival. Nancy, with her unwavering focus, and Jonathan, with his quiet, simmering resolve, were the leaders. Steve, for the first time, was just a follower, a scared kid with a baseball bat. He was being initiated into a secret society, a club for those who had seen what lurked in the shadows. The price of admission was belief. By choosing to stay, by choosing to face the inexplicable horror alongside Nancy and Jonathan, he was tacitly admitting that his entire worldview had been wrong. The freaks and the weirdos were the only ones who knew the truth. His old life, his old self, was dying in that dimly lit living room, replaced by a raw, terrified awareness that nothing would ever be the same again. The king was becoming a soldier, drafted into a war he didn't know existed just moments before. And his weapon wasn't his status or his charm. It was a crude, nail-studded bat. The moment of truth arrived not with a slow dawning, but with the violent, sickening tear of wallpaper. 1 second, Steve was a scared kid and over his head, clutching a baseball bat with trembling hands. The next, he was face to face with the impossible. The Demogorgon, a creature born of nightmare, ripped its way into the buyer's living room, its faceless head unfolding like a grotesque flower of teeth. In that instant, every rule of Steve's known universe was incinerated. Fear, pure and primal, seized him. All his high school bravado, all his kingly confidence evaporated. He did the only thing that made sense. He fled. He scrambled back out the window he'd just entered, abandoning Nancy and Jonathan to their fate. He ran to his car, the engine turning over, his one thought to escape, to drive away and pretend none of this was real. This was the defining crossroads of his life. He could have kept driving, leaving the horrors of the buyer's house and his own cowardice in the rearview mirror. He could have tried to rebuild his old life, piece by piece, telling himself it was all a bad dream, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the image of Nancy's terrified face. Maybe it was a flicker of a conscience he didn't know he possessed. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the first stirrings of the man he was going to become. Sitting in his car, the engine idling, the sounds of the struggle filtering out from the house, Steve Harrington made the most important decision of his life. He turned the car off. He got out. He picked up the nail-studded bat he had almost left behind. He walked back to the house, his fear now eclipsed by a desperate, burgeoning courage. When he re-entered the living room, the scene was dire. The Demogorgon had Jonathan pinned, its horrifying maw ready to close over him. Without a second thought, Steve charged. He swung the bat, connecting with the creature with a sickening thud. The monster reeled, its shriek of pain an alien sound in the suburban home. This was his first real battle, not for status or a girlfriend, but for life itself. He wasn't King Steve anymore. He was a warrior. He fought alongside Jonathan, the boy he despised just days before, their previous animosity forgotten in the face of a common enemy. They were no longer jock and freak. They were just two young men trying to survive the night. When the Demogorgon was finally forced back into the fiery trap and seemingly vanquished, the immediate aftermath was a deafening silence, broken only by ragged breaths. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a chilling cocktail of shock, relief, and a profound, world-altering understanding. Nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed, Steve processed the trauma in the only way he knew how, through small, quiet actions. The old Steve would have bragged about his heroics, spun the tale to enhance his legend. The new Steve was humbled, subdued. He showed up at the police station, not to make a statement, but to see if Nancy and Jonathan were okay. He was an outsider now, peering into the circle of those who truly understood the depth of the trauma, a circle that now included the Wheeler and Byers families. His most significant act came at Christmas. He went to the Byers' house, a place now forever marked by terror in his mind, and delivered a gift. It was a new camera for Jonathan, a replacement for the one he had broken in a fit of jealous rage. It was more than just an apology. It was a peace treaty. It was an acknowledgement of his own wrongdoing and a gesture of respect to the boy he had so thoroughly misjudged. He didn't stay long. He just handed over the gift and left, catching a glimpse of the happy family inside. Will, safe and sound, celebrating with his loved ones. Steve, watching from the outside, was no longer the king at the center of the party. He was a solitary figure, standing in the cold, forever changed by the battle he had fought. The conflict had cost him his girlfriend and his blissful ignorance, but the aftermath revealed a gain he couldn't yet quantify, the first tentative emergence of his own character. The crown was gone, but for the first time, Steve Harrington was standing on his own 2 feet. The year following the battle at the Byers' house was a period of strange, unsettling limbo for Steve Harrington. The world had, on its surface, returned to normal. The hole in the wall at the lab was sealed. Will Byers was back with his friends, and the official story was a cocktail of plausible lies about power surges and missing kids. But for Steve, there was no going back. He was lost, adrift in the chasm between his old life and the new, terrifying reality he now knew existed. He and Nancy were still together, but their relationship was a ghost, haunting the halls of Hawkins High. They were trying desperately to pretend to fit back into the molds of the popular jock and the perfect girlfriend, but the shared trauma was a silent, corrosive presence between them. They were like two soldiers trying to reacclimate to civilian life, unable to speak of the war only they and a few others had fought. Steve's coping mechanism was denial. His advice to Nancy was simple and deeply flawed. Let's just pretend it never happened. He wanted to bury the memories of the Demogorgon, of the nails in the bat, of his own paralyzing fear. He believed that if they could just act normal, they could eventually feel normal again. He tried to steer them back to familiar territory, parties, making out, worrying about college applications. But Nancy couldn't pretend. She was consumed by guilt, specifically over Barb. The image of her friend, abandoned and forgotten, was a wound that would not heal. This disconnect came to a head at a Halloween party. Dressed as Tom Cruise from Risky Business, Steve was trying to recapture the carefree spirit of his past. But Nancy, drunk and drowning in her own grief, couldn't play along anymore. In a moment of brutal, alcohol-fueled honesty, she looked at him, at their costumes, at their entire relationship, and declared it all bullshit. The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was the public execution of their relationship, a confirmation of what he had been trying so desperately to ignore. Their love wasn't real, she slurred. Not anymore. It was just a performance. The breakup was the final death knell for King Steve. Without Nancy, his queen, his kingdom felt empty. His attempts to reassert his dominance at school fell flat. A new king had arrived in Hawkins, Billy Hargrove. Billy was everything Steve used to be, but amplified and twisted. He had the car, the hair, the arrogant swagger, but his charisma was laced with a genuine, unpredictable menace. When Steve tried to put Billy in his place on the basketball court, he was utterly outmatched. He lost the game, lost his status as the school's top dog, and was left looking like a relic of a bygone era. Stripped of his girlfriend and his social standing, Steve was truly alone. He tried to apologize to Nancy, bringing her a bouquet of roses, but he found her with Jonathan. Again. This time, however, the jealousy was different. It was quieter, tinged with a sad resignation. He left the flowers on her doorstep and walked away, finally accepting that part of his life was over. This lost era was crucial for his development. It was a period of ego death. Everything he had once used to define himself, his popularity, his relationship, his status, had been stripped away. He was forced to confront himself, not as King Steve, but just as Steve. It was during this low point, this phase of rebuilding from the ground up, that he found an unexpected and unlikely purpose. It came in the form of a frantic, nerdy freshman with a problem involving a creature from another dimension. Dustin Henderson, desperate for help with his new pet, Dart, had been rejected by his other friends. His last resort was Steve Harrington. In that moment, Steve, with nothing left to lose, said yes. He was no longer a king, but he was about to find a new, far more noble calling: babysitter. The reemergence of the threat to Hawkins came not as a single, terrifying creature, but as a creeping, insidious plague. It started with rotting pumpkins, a strange blight spreading across the farmlands, a symptom of a sickness deep within the earth. For most of the town, it was a bizarre agricultural mystery. For those who knew what lurked beneath, it was a chilling omen. For Steve Harrington, the new threat was more personal and immediate. It was the threat of utter irrelevance. His breakup with Nancy, solidified by her drunken bullshit monologue, had sent him into a tailspin. He was clinging to the wreckage of his former life, offering Nancy terrible advice and trying to maintain a semblance of their old routine. He was trying to be the old Steve, the one who could solve problems with a charming smile and a dose of denial. But that Steve was gone, and Nancy knew it. The true reemergence of the supernatural threat in his life didn't come from a lab or a gate. but from a frantic phone call from a kid, Dustin Henderson, a boy Steve barely knew, had found a creature in his trash can. A small, slug-like thing he'd named D'Artagnan, or Dart. Dustin, a budding scientist, was fascinated. Steve, when he was finally roped in, was horrified. He immediately recognized the creature's lineage. It was a smaller, larval version of the same monster he had fought a year ago. The nightmare was starting all over again. His first instinct was aggression. He showed up at the Henderson house with his nail-studded bat, ready to kill the thing. But he was met with Dustin's fierce, protective loyalty to his new pet. This was Steve's first real encounter with the party's dynamic. He was an outsider, trying to impose his will on a group with its own rules and its own deep-seated bonds. The situation escalated quickly. Dart escaped, molted, and grew at an alarming rate. Developing a taste for more than just 3 Musketeers bars, it ate the Henderson family cat. The reality crashed down on Dustin. His pet wasn't a new species to be discovered. It was a baby Demogorgon, or as Dustin terrifyingly dubbed it, a Demodog. The true nature of the new threat became clear. It wasn't just one monster. Will Byers's visions, the rotting pumpkin patches, and Dart were all connected to a single, colossal entity that Will called the Mind Flayer. It was a shadow monster from the upside down, a hive-mind intelligence that was spreading its influence into their world, using the newly reopened gate as its entry point. Its goal was not just to kill, but to conquer and consume. For Steve, this new threat was different. Last time, he was an unwilling participant dragged into the chaos at the very end. This time, he was one of the first responders. The threat re-emerged in his life through his new, strange connection to Dustin. He was no longer fighting for a girl or for his own survival. He was stepping up to protect a kid who had nowhere else to turn. He found himself giving Dustin advice, not just about monsters, but about girls and life. He shared the secret to his famous hair, Farrah Fawcett spray, in a moment of genuine bonding. He was starting to build a new identity, not as a king, but as a mentor. He was using his past experiences, both the good and the bad, to guide someone else. The idea that re-emerged alongside the Mind Flayer was the idea of found family. Steve, having lost his girlfriend and his social circle, was slowly being absorbed into a new one. He was becoming a part of the party's strange, chaotic orbit. He wasn't their peer. He was their reluctant guardian, their slightly less scared than them adult supervision. The monster was bigger, the stakes were higher, but Steve was facing it with a newfound sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting to get his old life back. He was fighting for the new one that was unexpectedly forming right in front of him. With King Steve dethroned and the Mind Flayer's influence spreading like a cancer beneath Hawkins, a new order began to crystallize. It wasn't a social hierarchy dictated by popularity or wealth, but a pragmatic alignment of survivors. And within this new order, Steve Harrington found himself in the most unexpected of roles. He was no longer the ruler, but the protector. He was no longer the cool older guy, but the beleaguered babysitter. This shift created a series of internal conflicts for Steve, forcing him to reconcile the person he used to be with the person he was becoming. The first major challenge to his old self-image came in the form of Billy Hargrove. After losing a basketball game and his girlfriend, Steve's ego was bruised. He attempted to confront Billy, to reclaim some semblance of his former authority, but it backfired spectacularly. Billy, already on edge due to his own abusive home life, and now frantic over his stepsister Max's disappearance with the party, was a coiled spring of aggression. The confrontation escalated into a full-blown fistfight in the Byers' living room, the same room where Steve had first fought the Demogorgon. This time, however, he lost decisively. Billy beat him to a bloody pulp, his face swollen and bruised, a physical manifestation of his fall from grace. He lay on the floor, defeated, while a group of kids, the very nerds he used to mock, had to save him by sedating his attacker. The humiliation was absolute. The old king was dead, and there was no question about it. But in this defeat, a new Steve was truly born. His internal conflict was no longer about his social standing. It was about his responsibility. He had promised Nancy he would keep the kids safe, and he had failed. As he recovered from the beating, his focus shifted entirely. His own pain, his own ego, became secondary. The new order was simple. The kids were the priority. This new dynamic was solidified in the junkyard. Led there by Dustin's flawed plan to lure Dart, Steve found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with Dustin, Lucas, and the new girl, Max. He was their shield. He was the one with the bat, the one who was supposed to be in charge. The scene was a perfect encapsulation of his new role. He was giving them advice, trying to maintain control, and simultaneously freaking out. He tried to project confidence, but his fear was palpable. He was just a teenager himself, armed with a baseball bat and a can of hairspray, facing down a pack of interdimensional monsters. When the demo dogs finally arrived, drawn to the scent of the meat, Steve's internal conflict vanished, replaced by pure protective instinct. He shoved the kids into the safety of an old bus and stood at the door, bat in hand, ready to hold the line. He wasn't fighting for glory or for a girl. He was fighting for them. He fought with a desperate ferocity, a lone guardian against a tide of darkness. It was a thankless, terrifying job, and he did it without hesitation. Inside the bus, another key part of this new order was forming. He and Max had a quiet moment, a conversation that went beyond the immediate threat. He acknowledged her skills, her bravery, and treated her as an equal, a stark contrast to how he initially dismissed her as an annoying tag-along. He was learning to see people for who they were, not for where they fit into his social pecking order. The internal conflict for Steve was the death of his ego. He had to let go of the need to be the king, to become something far more valuable, the babysitter. He had to accept his own vulnerability and his own failures to find his true strength. By the time they were forced to flee the junkyard, the new order was firmly established. Steve Harrington was the reluctant, battered, but fiercely loyal guardian of the party. His purpose was no longer to rule the school, but to protect its smallest, most vulnerable, and bravest members. The junkyard was a crucible, forging a new role for Steve Harrington. But the true turning point, the single pivotal event that cemented his transformation from fallen king to selfless guardian, took place in the dark, winding tunnels beneath Merrill's farm. After the Demodog attack, the group, Steve, Dustin, Lucas, and Max, found themselves reunited with Nancy, Jonathan, and the others, converging on the Byers house, the perennial epicenter of Hawkins's nightmares. There, they learned the horrifying truth. The Mind Flayer had infected Will, using him as a spy, seeing through his eyes. The tunnels, the rot, the Demodogs, they were all part of one interconnected superorganism, a biological extension of the Upside Down spreading into their world. And at its heart was the gate. Deep beneath the Hawkins National Laboratory, the plan, hatched in a flurry of desperate intellect by a group of kids and traumatized teens, was audacious. They needed to create a diversion to draw the Demodogs away from the lab, allowing Eleven and Hopper to close the gate. They would do this by setting fire to the central hub of the tunnel network, the heart of the hive mind, causing the entity enough pain to trigger a response. It was a suicide mission, and someone had to lead the way down into that subterranean hell. Without a moment of hesitation, Steve volunteered. This was the critical point. There was no glory in this decision. There was no audience to impress. He was battered and bruised from his fight with Billy, his face a swollen mess. He was terrified. Yet, he picked up his Zippo lighter and his nail-studded bat and prepared to descend into the darkness. He wasn't alone for long. The kids, led by a surprisingly brave Max, refused to let him go alone. They were a team now, a dysfunctional, terrified, but fiercely loyal family. Armed with gasoline and makeshift torches, they climbed down the rope into the stinking, vine-choked tunnels. The atmosphere was claustrophobic and terrifying. The air was thick with alien spores. The walls pulsed with a malevolent life, and the sound of distant, chittering monsters echoed through the darkness. Steve was at the front, leading the charge. He was no longer just a babysitter. He was their commander. His fear was evident, but his resolve was stronger. He was singularly focused on the mission and, more importantly, on the safety of the children behind him. He navigated them through the labyrinthine passages, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement, his bat held at the ready. When they finally reached the hub, the central nexus of the hive mind, the true horror of the situation became clear. It was a vast cavern of pulsing, interconnected vines, a living, breathing heart of pure evil. As they doused the area with gasoline, a demodog appeared, drawn by the disturbance. For a moment, everyone froze, but then something incredible happened. The demodog wasn't looking at them. It was looking at Dart's Three Musketeers wrapper dropped by Dustin. In a moment of incredible risk and faith, Dustin stood before the creature and spoke to it, appealing to the memory of the bond they once shared. The creature, for a brief, miraculous moment, seemed to recognize him. It was a tense, beautiful, and utterly bizarre standoff that bought them the time they need. They lit the fire. The hub ignited in a massive conflagration, and the hive mind shrieked in agony through Will Byers miles away. The plan worked. The demodogs, summoned by their master's pain, began racing towards them. The turning point was complete. Steve's only thought was escape. He screamed for the kids to run, grabbing them, pushing them, ensuring every single one of them got to the rope first. He was the last one to ascend, the demodogs snapping at his heels, emerging from the ground just as the creatures swarmed the area below. He had led them into hell and brought them all back safe. This single, pivotal event was the culmination of his entire arc in Season 2. He had faced his fear, embraced his responsibility, and led his new family through their darkest hour. He didn't do it for praise or to win back his crown. He did it because it was the right thing to do. The boy who once abandoned his girlfriend to a single monster had just risked his life to save 4 kids from an entire army of them. The transformation was no longer in question. It was complete. The fall of King Steve was a gradual process, a slow erosion of status and ego. But his final transformation into the person he was meant to be was forged in the heat of 2 brutal physical confrontations. The first was his humiliating defeat at the hands of Billy Hargrove. The second, and far more significant, was his role in the final battle against the Mind Flayer's forces. This was not the fall of his body, but the fall of his selfishness and the complete transformation of his purpose. After leading the kids out of the burning tunnels, a battered and exhausted Steve arrived at the Byers' house just in time for another crisis. Billy, manipulated by his father and enraged by Max's defiance, had tracked them down. He burst into the house, a tornado of human fury, and immediately attacked Lucas. Steve, without a second thought, intervened. He stood between Billy and the kids, trying to de-escalate, trying to be the adult in the room. "It's not his fault," Steve pleaded. "It's yours." He took the blame, trying to shield the children from Billy's wrath. But Billy was beyond reason. He shoved Steve aside and went after Lucas again. And Steve snapped. He threw a punch, landing a solid blow on Billy's face. "You touch those kids again," Steve snarled, his voice raw with protective rage, "and I'm going to kill you." For a fleeting moment, it seemed like Steve might actually win. He was fighting with a purpose beyond himself, a righteous anger that gave him strength. He tackled Billy, raining punches down on him, screaming at him to stay away from the kids. But Billy was a stronger, more brutal fighter. He turned the tables, pinning Steve to the ground and beating him mercilessly. He smashed a plate over Steve's head, knocking him unconscious. The fall was brutal and complete. He lay broken and bleeding on the floor, having failed to stop the immediate physical threat. But his sacrifice was not in vain. It bought the kids precious seconds. It was a display of such selfless courage that it inspired Max to finally stand up to her brother, grabbing the sedative-filled syringe and plunging it into his neck. Steve's physical fall led to Max's rise. He lost the fight, but he won the war by showing her what it means to protect the people you care about. His transformation was complete. When he regained consciousness, groggy and in immense pain, his first thought wasn't for himself. It was for the kids. He was no longer a participant in the main event. His role now was to support and protect. As 11 prepared for her psychic battle with the mind flayer, Steve's job was to get the others to safety. He herded a sedated Billy, Max, and the rest of the party into his car, becoming their designated driver and guardian. His final, crucial contribution to the battle was a quiet conversation in the car. He saw Dustin, heartbroken over Dart's death in the tunnels, and offered a moment of quiet empathy. More importantly, he had a conversation with Nancy. There was no jealousy, no resentment. He looked at her, then at Jonathan, and gave them his blessing. "Go get him," he said, encouraging Nancy to go be with Jonathan as he helped his mother and brother. It was a moment of profound maturity. He was letting her go, not out of defeat, but out of a genuine desire for her happiness. He had finally, truly, moved on. The figure of King Steve had completely fallen away. In its place stood someone new, someone who had been beaten, humiliated, and terrified, but who had emerged with a quiet strength and a clear sense of what truly mattered. He had been transformed by fire, by fists, and by his fierce, unexpected love for a group of nerdy kids. His status was gone, his face was a wreck, but his character was, for the first time, whole. The king was dead. Long live Dad Steve. The year between the closing of the gate and the summer of 1984 should have been a time of peace and normalcy for Steve Harrington. But the world had moved on, and it seemed to have left him behind. While his younger friends were navigating the dramas of middle school romance, Steve was thrust into the harsh reality of post-high school life in a small town. His grades weren't good enough for college, and the promised job at his father's company never materialized. His new reality was a humiliating sailor-themed uniform and a paper hat. He was an employee at Scoops Ahoy, the ice cream parlor in the newly opened Starcourt Mall. This is where he met the next pivotal figure in his life, someone who would challenge him, partner with him, and ultimately become his closest confidant, Robin Buckley. Robin was his co-worker, a former classmate he barely remembered from band. She was sharp, sarcastic, and deeply unimpressed by his faded King Steve charm. From their first interactions, she served as a perfect foil to him. While Steve was trying to use his job as a platform to pick up girls, tallying his failures on a whiteboard he labeled, "You rule, you suck," Robin was there to mock his every attempt. She saw right through his smooth-talking facade, calling him out on his manufactured personality and his clumsy pickup lines. She wasn't an antagonist in the traditional sense, but she was an antagonist to his ego. She refused to let him get away with his old tricks. She was the first person his age who met him not as the former king of Hawkins High, but as the guy in the goofy sailor suit who couldn't close the deal. Their dynamic was one of witty banter and constant jabs. He'd try to be cool. She'd cut him down with a dry intellectual wit. Yet, beneath the sarcasm, a genuine friendship began to form in the shared boredom of their summer job. They were partners in mediocrity, united by the sticky counters and the endless parade of mall-goers. It was Robin's sharp mind that propelled them into the next great mystery. When Dustin burst into Scoops Ahoy, fresh from science camp with a tale of an intercepted secret Russian communication, Steve was initially dismissive. It sounded crazy, another one of Dustin's nerdy flights of fantasy. But Robin was intrigued. She was a natural code breaker, fluent in multiple languages, and the puzzle of the coded message piqued her curiosity. She was the one who cracked it. She realized the message wasn't just sounds. It was a sequence of phrases that corresponded to locations within the mall itself. "The week is long. The silver cat feeds," she deciphered, her mind working in ways Steve's never could. Her intelligence became the engine of their investigation, while Steve provided the muscle, the street smarts, and the increasingly necessary bravery. Robin provided the brains. She was the one who figured out the deliveries were likely carrying something other than what was on the manifest, the one who convinced him to sneak into the back corridors of the mall. Robin's introduction was crucial because she was the first person to build a relationship with the new Steve. She had no baggage from his past, no memory of him as the arrogant jock. She only knew him as the slightly dim, surprisingly earnest guy who scooped ice cream alongside her. She helped solidify his transformation by treating him not as a fallen king, but as an equal partner. She saw his kindness, his loyalty to Dustin, and his surprising courage, and she valued those things far more than the reputation he once had. She was not a damsel to be rescued, or a queen to be won. She was his partner, his intellectual superior in many ways, and the person who would stand by his side as they stumbled upon a conspiracy far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined, hidden just feet beneath the food court. The second major conflict for Steve was a stark departure from the first. The battle with the Demogorgon and the Mind Flayer had been a primal struggle against monstrous, otherworldly forces. This new conflict, unfolding in the summer of 1985, was one of espionage, conspiracy, and Cold War paranoia, hidden in plain sight beneath the garish, neon-lit consumerism of the Starcourt Mall. The stakes were no longer just about the survival of their small group, but had broadened to encompass a geopolitical threat that could have devastating consequences. It all began with Dustin's radio transmission. With Robin's linguistic and analytical skills, the Scoops Troop, Steve, Dustin, Robin, and eventually Lucas's sharp-witted younger sister Erica, cracked the code. They realized the mysterious shipments were coming to the mall, guarded by armed men. Their investigation took on the feel of a Hardy Boys novel mixed with a spy thriller. They used binoculars from the rooftop, timed deliveries, and drew up complex theories about what the Russians were smuggling. Steve, fully embracing his role as the group's dad, was a mixture of caution and gung-ho enthusiasm. He was the one who tried to keep them grounded. Yet, he was also the one willing to take the biggest risks. He was their lookout, their getaway driver in theory, and their primary source of often flawed but well-intentioned strategic advice. The investigation led them to a locked door in a service corridor, guarded by a menacing, armed Russian operative. Their mission shifted from observation to infiltration. Using Erica's small stature and her unapologetic capitalism, demanding a lifetime supply of free ice cream for her services, they found a way in. She crawled through the ventilation shafts, a tiny saboteur, and unlocked the door from the inside. What they found was not a storeroom, but an elevator, a deep, descending elevator that plunged them miles beneath the mall. This was the point of no return. As the elevator descended, the conflict transformed. They were no longer just kids messing around in a mall. They were trespassers in a secret underground Soviet military base. The fluorescent lights of Starcourt were replaced by the cold, industrial green of a hidden fortress. Armed soldiers patrolled the corridors. Scientists in lab coats worked on a massive, laser-like machine, and the entire operation hummed with a sinister purpose. The broader stakes became terrifyingly clear. The machine the Russians were building was a key, a massive drill designed to tear a new hole into the fabric of reality. They were trying to reopen the gate to the Upside Down, the very portal that Eleven had sacrificed so much to close. The Russians didn't seem to understand the full horror of what they were unleashing. They just saw it as a weapon, a foothold in another dimension that they could exploit. Steve and the Scoops Troop were now behind enemy lines, armed with nothing but an ice cream scooper and their wits. Their conflict was one of survival and escape. They navigated the labyrinthine base, dodging guards, trying to find a way back to the surface. Steve's leadership here was crucial. He was no longer just the babysitter. He was the point man. He was the one who took the lead in a firefight, using a canister to knock out a soldier. He was the one who made the split-second decisions, trying to keep his small, terrified team alive. The conflict was broader, but also more intimate. Trapped together in the sterile, hostile environment of the Russian base, the bond between Steve and Robin deepened. They relied on each other completely, their sarcastic banter now a coping mechanism in the face of mortal danger. The stakes had been raised from a monstrous entity trying to consume their town to a human enemy trying to weaponize it. The horror was no longer just supernatural. It was man-made, born of ideology and ambition. Steve Harrington, the former king of the mall, was now trapped in its dark underbelly, fighting a secret war he never signed up for. with the fate of his town and perhaps the world resting on the shoulders of two ice cream scoopers and two kids. In the cold, green-lit corridors of the Russian base, the Scoops troops' luck finally ran out. After a brief, chaotic skirmish with a group of guards, Steve and Robin created a diversion, allowing Dustin and Erica to escape through the ventilation shafts. But in doing so, they sacrificed themselves. They were captured, dragged away, and thrown into a stark interrogation room. This was Steve's greatest sacrifice yet. It wasn't a moment of heroic, bat-swinging bravado. It was a quiet, terrifying submission to fate in order to save his friends. The loss was immediate and profound. The loss of freedom, the loss of control, and the imminent threat of a painful death. Tied back to back in chairs, they were confronted by a brutal Russian officer and a scientist. The interrogation began. The Russians wanted to know who they were and who they worked for. Steve, ever the protector, immediately fell into a role. He tried to be the tough guy, the all-American hero from the movies. He spouted defiant, sarcastic nonsense about being part of a secret government agency, about their top-secret mission. He was trying to shield Robin, to draw the fire, to be the hero he thought he was supposed to be. But his bravado was a thin, pathetic shield against the grim reality of their situation. The Russians didn't buy it for a second. The officer beat him, punching him repeatedly in the face, demanding answers. Steve's defiance crumbled under the physical assault, his face quickly becoming a bloody mess, eerily reminiscent of his fight with Billy. But he refused to break. He refused to give up Dustin and Erica. He endured the beating, his sacrifice now measured in bruises and broken skin. When physical force failed to yield results, the Russians turned to chemical methods. The scientist injected both Steve and Robin with a powerful, disorienting truth serum. This was a different kind of violation, a devastating loss of their own minds. The drug twisted their perception of reality, making the room spin, blurring the lines between what was real and what was a hallucination. They were completely vulnerable, their deepest secrets and fears now accessible to their enemies. Under the influence of the serum, their defenses shattered. They babbled, they laughed hysterically. They confessed everything and nothing at the same time. Steve, in his drugged stupor, still tried to protect Robin, his concern for her overriding his own terror and disorientation. The experience was a shared trauma, a crucible that bonded them in a way nothing else could have. They were rescued, in a stroke of luck, by Dustin and Erica, who had managed to find and recruit help from the adults, Joyce and Hopper. But the escape didn't end the ordeal. The devastating loss wasn't just physical, it was psychological. As they hid in the mall's movie theater, the after effects of the drug continued to ravage their minds. They were giggly, paranoid, and emotionally raw. The experience had stripped them down to their barest, most vulnerable selves. This sacrifice was the price of their heroism. Steve had willingly walked into captivity to save the kids, and in doing so, had subjected himself and his new best friend to torture, both physical and psychological. He had lost his physical well-being, his mental clarity, and any remaining shred of the invincibility he might have once felt. He was no longer just a babysitter or a soldier. He was a prisoner of war, forever marked by the trauma of that cold, sterile room deep beneath the Starcourt Mall. The psychological and emotional fallout from the Russian interrogation culminated in one of the most pivotal and heartfelt scenes in Steve Harrington's entire story. Hiding from their pursuers, Steve and Robin stumbled into a public restroom in the Starcourt Mall, the lingering effects of the truth serum making the world a dizzying, unstable place. The garish tile and fluorescent lights of the bathroom became a strange sort of confessional, a sanctuary where two drugged, terrified people could finally be honest with each other. The scene began with a wave of drug-induced nausea. As they both recovered from vomiting, the walls they had so carefully constructed around themselves crumbled completely. Steve, his face bruised and swollen, his mind still swimming, looked at Robin. In the haze of the drugs and the shared trauma of their capture, his long-standing crush on her A crush he had been nursing all summer came pouring out. He confessed that he had finally found the one. He described how he had a crush on her since she laughed at his expense in a history class he didn't even remember. He spoke of her passion, her intelligence, her humor, the way she wasn't like the other girls he had known. It was a clumsy, heartfelt, and incredibly vulnerable confession. He was laying his heart bare, not as King Steve with a smooth pickup line, but as a beaten, exhausted young man who had found someone he genuinely admired and cared for. He was offering her the last piece of his old self, the part that still believed his happy ending involved getting the girl. It was a moment pregnant with the possibility of a traditional Hollywood ending. The hero, having proven his worth, confesses his love to his partner, and they seal it with a kiss. But stranger things subverted that expectation entirely. Robin listened to his confession, her own drugged mind processing his words, and then she gently, hesitantly confessed her own truth. She explained why she was so obsessed with him back in school. It wasn't because she had a crush on him. It was because the girl she had a crush on, Tammy Thompson, couldn't stop staring at him. But she's a girl, Steve said, his mind slowly piecing it together. Steve, Robin said, her voice trembling with the weight of her secret. And in that moment, he understood. Robin was gay. The emotional fallout of this revelation was the final, definitive test of Steve's character. The old Steve, the product of a casually homophobic 1980s high school culture, might have reacted with confusion, disgust, or rejection. But this was not the old Steve. He sat there for a moment, silent, processing this new information. The camera lingered on his face, a canvas of conflicting emotions. And then he broke into a grin. He didn't just accept her, he embraced her, immediately folding this new truth into their friendship. He pivoted from her rejection of him to mocking Tammy Thompson's singing voice. She sounds like a muppet, he joked. And in that instant, any tension, any awkwardness vanished. They both burst into laughter, a shared, cathartic release. The sound of their laughter, echoing in the sterile bathroom, was the sound of a new kind of love story. It wasn't romantic, but it was a deep, profound, and unconditional acceptance. This was the true emotional resolution of his transformation. His journey was never about getting the girl. It was about learning to love people for who they truly are. His immediate, unqualified support for Robin was the ultimate proof that the selfish, judgmental King Steve was well and truly dead. He had been stripped of his status, beaten by his rivals, tortured by his enemies, and had just been rejected by the girl he liked. And in the aftermath of all that loss, he found something far more valuable, a true, platonic soulmate. The psychological fallout of the Russian base wasn't just trauma. It was a forced, chemical-induced honesty that allowed him to forge the most important and authentic friendship of his life, with their minds still reeling from the truth serum and their bodies aching from their ordeal. Steve and Robin emerged from the bathroom not as a potential couple, but as an unbreakably bonded team. The final push for the Battle of Starcourt Mall had begun, and they were, quite literally, in the eye of the storm. Their immediate goal was to reconnect with the others and warn them about the Russians and the reopened gate. They stumbled into a screening of Back to the Future, where they found Dustin and Erica. The reunion was a chaotic, giddy affair, colored by the lingering effects of the drugs. The four of them, the Scoops troupe, were back together, and they now held a critical piece of the puzzle. They knew about the key, the machine the Russians were using to pry open the gate. They knew there was a massive military operation happening directly beneath their feet. Meanwhile, the other factions of the Hawkins Hero Squad were converging. 11, Mike, and the rest of the party were at the mall, having fled the Mind Flayer's newly corporeal form, a monstrous entity made of melted-down rats and humans. Nancy and Jonathan were also en route, trying to get help. The final push required all these disparate groups to unite, to share their information, and to form a cohesive plan. For Steve, this phase was about finding his place within the larger team. He was no longer the lone babysitter or the co-leader of a small splinter group. He was now a seasoned veteran, a key player in a much larger ensemble. His preparation for the end wasn't about strategy or planning. That was left to the likes of Nancy, Joyce, and the kids. His preparation was about action. He was the muscle, the driver, the first one to volunteer for the dangerous jobs. When Joyce and Hopper's plan to infiltrate the base and destroy the machine was communicated via walkie-talkie, the group in the mall was assigned a critical support role. They needed to provide a distraction and, more importantly, get 11, who had been injured and was now vulnerable, to safety. The plan was to use Hopper's abandoned station wagon to escape, but the car wouldn't start. In a moment of sheer panic, they realized the Mind Flayer's monstrous form was in the mall, hunting them, its psychic connection to 11 leading it right to them. In this moment of crisis, Steve's role as protector kicked in once more. They were trapped, with the monster closing in. The solution came in the form of the Todd Father, the gaudy convertible that Billy had won in a mall contest, its keys still dangling from the ignition. The new plan was simple and insane: steal the car and use it as a getaway vehicle. But first, they needed a distraction. Nancy, ever the pragmatist, realized they could use the car as a weapon. This led to Steve's final, crucial act of preparation. He, along with Nancy, Jonathan, Robin, Lucas, and Max, would stay behind to fight the monster, to draw its attention away from 11. He was preparing to go head-to-head with the physical manifestation of the Mind Flayer, a creature of unimaginable power. His weapon of choice this time? Fireworks, provided by Lucas's stash. The final push was a chaotic scramble for survival and a desperate attempt to protect their most powerful yet most vulnerable friend. Steve, despite his drug-addled state, was a pillar of steadfast courage. He didn't hesitate. He didn't question the plan. He just grabbed a handful of fireworks and prepared to face the monster. He had spent the last 2 years being dragged into these fights, but now he was running towards them willingly. His preparation was complete. He was ready to stand his ground, side by side with his friends, old and new, against the greatest threat they had ever faced. The final confrontation at Starcourt Mall was a symphony of chaos, a multi-front war fought by a scattered group of heroes against an enemy both human and monstrous. Steve Harrington was at the very heart of the battle's most visceral and dangerous theater, the mall's main concourse. As 11 and the others attempted to escape, Steve, Robin, Nancy, Jonathan, and the kids initiated their desperate plan. They stood on the upper level of the mall, armed with Lucas's scavenged fireworks, and began to bombard the colossal spider monster, the Mind Flayer's gruesome physical form. It was a pathetic arsenal against such a creature, but it was all they had. Their goal was simple: piss it off, draw its attention, and keep it from pursuing 11. Steve was on the front line of this assault, lighting fuses and hurling Roman candles at the beast below. His actions were a blend of terror and reckless bravery. He was screaming, he was laughing, he was fully committed to this insane, suicidal gambit. The monster, enraged by the fiery assault, turned its full attention on them, its screeching roars echoing through the shattered mall. The creature was too powerful, too relentless. It began to smash its way up to their level, forcing them to retreat. The climax of Steve's personal battle came not against the monster, but in a desperate, high-speed chase. As the Mind Flayer closed in on the car, where 11, Mike, and Max were trapped, a new vehicle careened into the mall's atrium, the Todd Father, with Steve at the wheel. Alongside him were Robin, Nancy, and Jonathan. Their new plan, born of desperation, was to use the car as a weapon to play a suicidal game of chicken with the Mind Flayer. Steve floored the accelerator, driving directly towards the monster, trying to lure it away. But the creature was fixated on 11. It was Billy, now fully controlled by the Mind Flayer, who blocked their path. He rammed his own car into theirs, disabling it. Steve and Robin were thrown from the vehicle, dazed and vulnerable. The final confrontation had splintered. Down in the Russian base, Joyce and Hopper were fighting to turn the keys and destroy the machine. In the mall, Billy was advancing on the kids, ready to deliver 11 to his master. Steve, weaponless and disoriented, could only watch in horror. He was powerless to stop it. The true climax wasn't his fight, but his bearing witness to the sacrifice of others. He watched as Billy, his former rival, broke through the Mind Flayer's control for a brief, beautiful moment and sacrificed himself to save 11. He watched as the creature, its connection to the Mind Flayer severed by Joyce turning the keys, collapsed into a lifeless heap of gore. The confrontation ended not with a bang, but with a sudden, deafening silence. The monster was dead. The Russians were in disarray, but the victory was drenched in sorrow. Hopper was gone, seemingly vaporized in the explosion that closed the gate. Billy was dead, a hero in his final moments. Steve, standing amidst the wreckage and the gore, was a survivor once again. His climax was not a single moment of triumph, but a series of courageous acts strung together. The firework assault, the car chase, the willingness to put his body between the monster and his friends. He didn't land the killing blow. He didn't save the day single-handedly, but he had held the line. He had done his part. The former king, who once couldn't be bothered to look after his girlfriend's friend for 5 minutes, had just spent an entire night risking his life for a group of people who had become his family. The battle was over, and Steve Harrington had survived. His transformation from selfish jock to selfless hero, now undeniable and complete. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Starcourt, a somber quiet settled over the survivors. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a landscape of grief, loss, and uncertainty. The mall, once a shining beacon of consumerist hope for Hawkins, was a smoldering ruin, a public monument to a secret war. Fire trucks and ambulances swarmed the scene, and a cover story was already being fabricated. A tragic fire, a terrible accident. For Steve, the resolution was not a celebration, but a quiet reckoning. He stood with Robin on the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a shock blanket, watching the chaos unfold. His face was a canvas of bruises and cuts, a physical record of the night's horrors. There was no victory parade, no acknowledgement of his heroism from the outside world. There was only the shared, silent understanding with the few who knew the truth. The immediate aftermath brought significant departures. Joyce Byers, having lost both Bob and now Hopper, made the heart-wrenching decision to finally leave Hawkins, taking Will and Jonathan with her. And because she had become a part of their broken family, she was taking 11 too. The scene of the Byers' moving truck pulling away was a devastating blow to the group's core. It was the end of an era. The party was being split apart, its members scattered. Steve watched them go, a silent farewell to his friends and to Nancy. His final moments with her were not romantic or dramatic. They were the quiet, comfortable goodbyes of two people who had been through a war together and had come out the other side as friends. The resolution of his romantic arc was a peaceful acceptance of its end. His most significant resolution, however, came in a small, mundane scene that perfectly encapsulated his new life. Months later, Steve and Robin, both jobless after the destruction of Scoops Ahoy, were looking for new work. They walked into the family video store, the last bastion of entertainment in a town that had lost its mall. Steve, attempting to leverage his expertise in movies, launched into a rambling, slightly pathetic, but utterly charming job application. He was trying to be the old Steve, the smooth talker, but it was clear his heart wasn't in it. He was awkward, bumbling, and ultimately unsuccessful. The manager, Keith, who still held a grudge against him from his days at the arcade, was unimpressed. But then Robin stepped in. With her sharp wit and intelligence, she talked circles around Keith, pointing out all the reasons they would be perfect employees. She didn't just get herself a job. She got Steve a job too. He was hired not on his own merits, but on the strength of his friendship with her. This was his new reality. He stood there in his ridiculous, hopeful interview attire and watched as his best friend secured their future, however humble it might be. The resolution for Steve Harrington wasn't about getting a medal or a promotion. It was about finding his place. He had lost his status, his girlfriend, and now many of his friends were gone. But he wasn't alone. He had Robin, he had a job, he had a found family, even if it was fractured. He was no longer the king of anything. He was just Steve Harrington, a guy who worked at the video store with his best friend. And for the first time in his life, that seemed to be enough. The true cost of their victories was not measured in the immediate aftermath of battle, but in the quiet, mundane months that followed. For Steve Harrington, the cost was a profound sense of stagnation. While the world kept turning, he felt stuck in neutral. The heroism, the life or death struggles had given him a sense of purpose that was now painfully absent. His life had become a series of rewound videotapes and awkward attempts at dating. He and Robin were the kings of the family video store, their witty banter echoing through the aisles. But it was a small, lonely kingdom. The thrill of the fight was gone, replaced by the monotony of customer service. He was a war hero living a civilian life, and the transition was not a smooth one. He was trying to move on, to find a girlfriend, to build a normal life, but his past clung to him. His reputation as King Steve had been so thoroughly dismantled that he now struggled to even get a date. His attempts were clumsy and transparent. He would try to use his job to meet women, offering them free rentals and movie recommendations, but his heart wasn't in it. His experiences had changed him so profoundly that he no longer knew how to connect with people who hadn't seen what he'd seen. How could he talk about his day when his most formative experiences involved fighting monsters from another dimension? The cost of his victory was a deep, unshakable loneliness. The very thing that had made him a hero, his bravery, his selflessness, his knowledge of the upside down, was the same thing that now isolated him from the normal world he so desperately wanted to rejoin. He was trapped between two realities, belonging fully to neither. This sense of being adrift was most apparent in his relationship with the kids. He was still their friend, their mentor, but they were growing up. Dustin was in high school now, part of a new D&D club, the Hellfire Club. They didn't need their babysitter in the same way. Steve was caught in a strange limbo, too old to be one of them, but too young and directionless to be a true adult figure like Joyce or Hopper had been. The unraveling of his life post-Starcourt was a slow, quiet process. It was the realization that surviving a war doesn't automatically grant you a happy ending. The world doesn't reward you for your secret heroism. It just keeps moving, and you have to find a way to move with it. The true cost for Steve was the understanding that his life might never be normal again. The trauma had changed him, but it had also given him a standard for excitement and purpose that a sleepy town like Hawkins could no longer meet. He was a warrior in a time of peace, and he was profoundly bored and a little bit sad. The victory at Starcourt had saved the world, but it had cost him his momentum. He was adrift, a ship without a rudder, waiting for the next storm to give him direction, unaware that a new, far more sinister tempest was already gathering on the horizon. The real cost was the quiet, gnawing fear that this, the video store, the failed dates, the feeling of being left behind, was all that was left for him. Despite his post-Starcourt malaise, the legacy of Steve Harrington's transformation was not forgotten by those who mattered. It wasn't a public legacy recorded in history books, but a private one, etched into the hearts of the friends he had repeatedly saved. His impact was measured in trust, loyalty, and the reflexive way the group turned to him when the shadows began to creep back into Hawkins. When a new evil, a sentient and terrifyingly intelligent creature from the Upside Down, later named Vecna, began murdering teenagers, the old team was forced to reassemble. And without hesitation, Steve stepped back into the role he had been born to play. His long-term legacy was that of the vanguard, the shield of the party. This was never more apparent than at Lover's Lake. When Max, targeted by Vecna, fell into a trance, the group discovered a new gate shimmering at the bottom of the lake. They needed to investigate it, to cross over into the Upside Down. There was no debate, no discussion about who would go first. Steve, without a moment's hesitation, stripped off his shirt and shoes and dove into the dark water. It was a perfect encapsulation of his character. See the danger, run towards it. He was no longer the reluctant hero. He was the first volunteer. What he found on the other side was a nightmare. He was pulled through the Watergate and emerged alone in the familiar, terrifying landscape of the Upside Down. Before he could even get his bearings, he was attacked not by a single demodog, but by a swarm of bat-like creatures, demobats. They swarmed him, biting and tearing at his flesh, wrapping their tails around his neck, choking the life out of him. It was a brutal, vicious assault, and for a moment, it seemed like his luck had finally run out. But his legacy was also the team he had helped build. Nancy, Robin, and Eddie Munson, the leader of the Hellfire Club, dove in after him, saving him at the last possible second. Lying on the ground in the Upside Down, bleeding from a dozen wounds, Steve's first thought was still of others. He worried about the bites being poisonous, not for his own sake, but for the risk he might pose to the others. It was in the quiet moments that followed, trapped in this decaying alternate reality, that the full impact of his journey came to light. He had a heartfelt conversation with Nancy, the girl who had started him on this path. He confessed his dreams for the future, a future he was now fighting for. He didn't dream of being a king or a hero. He dreamed of a Winnebago, of driving across the country with a whole brood of kids, 6 little nuggets, and being the kind of father his own had never been. It was a humble, beautiful dream, a testament to how profoundly he had changed. His values were no longer centered on status, but on family, love, and connection. His long-term impact was on the very fabric of their group. He was the reliable, steadfast heart. He was the one you could count on to have your back, to take the first hit, to dive into the dark water. He and Nancy shared a moment of rekindled connection, a look that suggested their story might not be over. But even that was colored by his growth. His feelings for her were no longer possessive, but rooted in a deep, shared history and mutual respect. The legacy of Steve Harrington was not written on a marquee or a trophy. It was written in the survival of his friends. It was in Dustin's confidence, in Robin's ability to be herself, in Nancy's trust. He was no longer King Steve, the boy with the great hair. He was Steve Harrington, the guy who would fight a swarm of demobats to protect his family. And in the dark, twisted world of the Upside Down, that was the only title that mattered. From the Crown Prince of Hawkins High to the battered guardian of the Upside Down secrets, Steve Harrington's journey is one of the most profound character evolutions in modern television. He began as a caricature, a walking embodiment of 80s movie antagonist tropes designed for us to root against. He was arrogant, selfish, and cruel. But season after season, the narrative stripped him of his armor, his status, his girlfriend, his pride, his very identity. And with each layer that was painfully peeled away, something more genuine and far more heroic was revealed beneath. He is the ultimate proof that heroes are not born. They are forged in the fires of loss, fear, and an unwavering commitment to the people they love. His story reframes the very idea of what it means to be strong. His greatest moments of strength were not his victories, but his defeats, the humbling fistfights, the terrifying captures, the quiet sacrifices. He found his purpose not by climbing the social ladder, but by descending into the literal and metaphorical darkness to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But as the Upside Down bleeds into Hawkins, merging 2 worlds into one final apocalyptic battlefield, one haunting question remains. Has Steve Harrington's luck, which has seen him survive Demogorgons, Demodogs, Russian soldiers, and Demobats, finally run out? Or will the universe grant the man who dreamed of nothing more than a family and a Winnebago, the one thing he has so truly and so painfully earned, a happy ending?